Hey guys, quick question. Have you ever been so hungry you considered eating your neighbor? No? Well, congratulations on your modern food delivery app-fueled existence. Because if you'd been born a few centuries earlier, let's be honest, Greg from next door would have looked like a viable entree around mid-January. Welcome to the bleak, frozen nightmare of medieval famine winters. A world so unrelentingly cruel that starvation wasn't just a risk, it was the seasonal entertainment. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Picture it, a remote medieval village, maybe somewhere in the 14th century England, perhaps nestled against the icy forests of Germany, or on a damp hillside in the Kingdom of France. Wherever it was miserable. The harvest had failed, again, maybe because of torrential rain, unseasonable frost, or that age-old agricultural threat, a plague of rats so aggressive you'd swear they were unionized. By November, the grain stores were already looking suspiciously empty. The root cellar, once a cheerful room filled with earthy-smelling turnips and cabbages, was now a depressing chamber of shriveled horrors and slimy onions you wouldn't feed to a goat. And this, dear viewer, is when the medieval peasant's second job title officially kicked in, professional sufferer, because a famine winter wasn't just cold and hungry. It was a drawn-out, months-long competition to see who could die the slowest and with the most dignity. Spoiler alert, no one won. Let's start with food rationing, which is a polite modern term for arguing with your spouse about whether it's morally acceptable to eat the family dog. In theory, medieval villages had methods for conserving food during lean times. They'd salt, smoke, and pickle whatever they could. Grain was stored in communal barns under lock and key, though the lock was usually just a large rock and the key was, "Please don't steal it." Meat was a rare treat, consumed quickly before it rotted, or preserved in lard, because nothing says culinary innovation like meat swimming in a bucket of its own fat. But no matter how carefully they prepared, when the ground froze solid and the snow piled up, it was never enough. Bread, the so-called staff of life, became a thin, sad affair made with whatever filler was available. Tree bark, ground-up ferns, the occasional handful of sawdust if things got really desperate. These emergency loaves were known to be so inedible that parish priests sometimes had to perform actual blessings over them just to get people to choke them down. Nothing says divine mercy like a piece of tree bark toast. By midwinter, when even the rats had packed their tiny suitcases and moved somewhere less apocalyptic, the villagers turned to foraging. Foraging in winter is a fascinating exercise because, spoiler, there's nothing there. A few brittle nettles, the occasional frozen berry, which probably tasted like disappointment. Mushrooms? Absolutely, though half of them were toxic, and the other half caused vivid hallucinations of food you didn't actually have. There's a reason medieval folklore is filled with stories of enchanted forests and sinister tree spirits. Most of those stories were written by starving people tripping balls on hallucinogenic fungi. Then there were the animals. In normal times, a medieval household might have a pig, a goat, maybe a few chickens, which were valuable not only as future meals, but as sources of milk, eggs, and status. By December, those animals had either been eaten or died of frostbite. If any lingered, they were emaciated, shivering skeletons too bony to be worth the trouble. And yet, desperation makes a person creative. There are recorded accounts of people boiling leather shoes to extract some kind of protein, of stewing belts and saddles, even of roasting mice on sticks, not as some rustic delicacy, but as an act of pitiful, feral necessity. Now, as much as medieval people loved their faith, and they did, hunger has a funny way of making folks slightly less virtuous. Theft became rampant, grain barns were broken into, root cellars mysteriously emptied overnight, chickens went missing, although everyone knew which neighbor took them. Justice was swift, public, and hilariously ineffective. The usual punishment was a public flogging or time spent in the village stocks. Of course, being put in the stocks in the dead of winter was essentially a death sentence. Standing immobilized for hours in sub-zero temperatures while jeering villagers pelted you with frozen horse manure? Charming. And yet, somehow, communities clung to their deeply superstitious beliefs that famine wasn't just bad luck or poor planning. It was a divine punishment for sin. Naturally, everyone began accusing everyone else of causing it. Old women, the classic scapegoats of European misery, were first in line, accused of witchcraft, bad omens, or simply existing in a suspiciously wrinkled state. They were driven from villages, sometimes murdered, sometimes left to starve alone in the woods. Which is ironic, because if anyone knew where to find a mushroom or two, it was probably them. Then came the most desperate measure of all, cannibalism. It wasn't common, it wasn't acceptable, and it certainly wasn't spoken of openly. But it happened. We know this because medieval chronicles, always a cheery read, occasionally broke from their usual lists of kings and battles to note that, in especially harsh winters, parents consumed their children, or that the dead were exhumed and devoured, which frankly makes your current problems with Uber Eats feel a lot less significant. One of the most notorious famine winters in medieval Europe occurred during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Triggered by relentless rain, crop failure, and disease, it devastated the continent's food supply. People ate dogs, horses, and reportedly even hanged criminals. Not because justice demanded it, but because the village stew pot was getting suspiciously empty. Chroniclers described entire families dying in their homes, snowdrifts piled against doors, while their neighbors debated whether or not to salvage the bodies. Spoiler, they did. But of course, famine wasn't just a culinary horror. It was a health disaster too. Starvation weakens the immune system. People fell victim to epidemics of typhus, dysentery, and something cheerfully known as the bloody flux, a disease so grim it basically involved you emptying yourself until you expired. And let's not forget hypothermia, which claimed as many lives as hunger. Medieval homes were little more than drafty wooden boxes. A central hearth provided the only heat, and it was usually reserved for cooking whatever god-awful slop was on the menu that day. Families huddled together at night like penguins, fighting for warmth and hoping Greg from next door didn't look too hungry. And because this was medieval Europe, where bad things could always get worse, famine winters often coincided with warfare. Local lords still demanded taxes in grain, meat, and labor, even when there was nothing left to give. Bands of mercenaries roamed the countryside, stripping villages of whatever pitiful supplies remained. Refugees from neighboring towns poured in, bringing with them tales of starvation, plague, and, you guessed it, cannibalism. The social order collapsed faster than your Wi-Fi on a stormy night. Meanwhile, the church, always ready with helpful advice, declared that suffering was a test of faith. Prayers, fasting, as if anyone needed encouragement, and public penance were prescribed. Flagellants, groups of religious zealots who whipped themselves bloody to atone for humanity's sins, became a common sight. Nothing boosts morale quite like a procession of shirtless men screaming and bleeding through the snow. And what about the nobility, you ask? Well, as usual, they did just fine. In their stone keeps and manors, the local lords still enjoyed salted venison, imported spices, and fresh-baked bread. They might issue a few pious proclamations or distribute some soup to the peasants, mostly to stop them from rioting. But for the most part, they were as removed from the misery as you are from the factory where your smartphone was made. The irony was that these same nobles would later complain about their diminished tax revenues, never quite connecting the dots between dead peasants and empty treasury. And so the winter dragged on, the snow deepened, the air grew colder. The night stretched endlessly, filled with the howling of wolves, the creak of frozen branches, and the ominous silence of homes where no fires burned. Each dawn revealed new deaths. Whole families disappeared overnight, leaving behind collapsed huts and half-eaten crusts of bark bread. Desperation reached such levels that villagers were known to draw lots, literal straws, to determine who among them would be sacrificed for the collective good. Imagine losing a life or death lottery and realizing your friends planned to slow roast you like a medieval rotisserie chicken. And that, dear viewers, is just the beginning. By late January, the medieval village wasn't so much a community as a loosely organized death cult clinging to increasingly unhinged survival strategies. The snow, once quaintly picturesque in that we'll die horribly by February kind of way, had turned into a cruel, unyielding sheet of ice covering every path, field, and abandoned corpse. And now came the most demented part of any famine winter, the false spring. Oh yes, because nature wasn't content to simply kill you with hunger and hypothermia. It liked to toy with you first. Every so often, a day would dawn slightly warmer. The sun would glint weakly off the snow. The icicles hanging from the church roof would drip, and for a fleeting, beautiful moment, it seemed like the nightmare might be ending. Birds sang. A child laughed, or maybe coughed blood. Difficult to tell at that point. And then the frost would return with twice the vengeance by sundown, casually murdering any livestock fool enough to venture out and freezing your remaining drinking water into an unbreakable hockey puck. And speaking of water, by now the village well was probably a health hazard so nightmarish it would make modern health inspectors spontaneously combust. Wells were shallow, often polluted, and by midwinter, half of them were either frozen solid or contaminated with runoff from nearby latrines. Because nothing complements a nice meal of boiled shoe leather quite like a side of cholera. Desperation gave rise to ingenious horrors. There are actual medieval accounts of people making pottage, a dubious soup of any organic matter still technically chewable. Cabbage leaves long past their prime, stray roots, old bones scraped clean of their previous meat sometime around Michaelmas. If you were lucky, you might find a dead crow or starling to toss in. If you were unlucky, your neighbor had already beaten you to it and was currently gnawing on a pigeon foot behind his hovel. And let's not forget about bread substitutes. Bark bread wasn't just a grim joke, it was real. Villagers stripped trees of their inner bark, ground it into a coarse meal, mixed it with a little flour or acorn paste, and baked it into loaves so dense and fibrous they doubled as self-defense weapons. Eating it was a dental hazard and a gastrointestinal tragedy. Consuming too much could cause intestinal blockages, which was ironic because dying of constipation during a famine is the sort of dark comedy only medieval life could deliver. But even as the food situation grew more absurd, the social order somehow managed to cling to its decaying framework. Parish priests still gave sermons, though by now they mostly consisted of unhelpful platitudes like, "Suffering brings you closer to God," and "Remember, Job had it worse." Lords still demanded taxes in kind. If not grain, then labor, firewood, or whatever shriveled root you hadn't already eaten. Famine, after all, was no excuse for shirking your feudal obligations. If anything, it was a character test, and the medieval nobility were always eager to find new ways to punish failing peasants. Meanwhile, the village's oldest, sickest, and most irritating residents mysteriously began to disappear. Officially, they succumbed to the cold or wandered off into the forest. In reality, they were the first casualties of the unspoken hunger protocol, thinning the herd. Harsh winters have a way of revealing just how thin the line is between civilization and savagery. And in the medieval world, that line was about as sturdy as wet parchment. Then came the wolves. Yes, literal wolves. Famine winters didn't just kill people, they devastated the natural world too. Deer starved, rabbits froze, and the forests emptied of easy prey. Packs of hungry, desperate wolves crept closer to villages, driven mad by the scent of death and the chance to feast on weakened livestock, children, and the occasional unguarded corpse. Contemporary records tell of wolves breaking into homes, dragging people from their beds, and fighting over bodies in churchyards. Entire families would barricade themselves indoors, praying the beasts would find easier targets elsewhere. And because everything in medieval life was a moral lesson wrapped in suffering, the appearance of wolves was naturally interpreted as divine judgment. The clergy declared them agents of the devil, sent to punish humanity for its wickedness. In response, villages organized ragtag militias armed with torches, pitchforks, and a handful of rusted swords older than the local bishop. These bands would stumble into the snowdrifts at night, attempting to fend off nature itself while quietly acknowledging they were more likely to freeze to death than successfully stab a wolf. If you somehow survived to February, congratulations. You had entered the terminal stage of famine winter, known unofficially as hope abandonment season. By this point, the snow had absorbed months of filth, blood, and human waste. The streets, if you could call the frozen sludge paths between huts streets, stank of decay. Fires burned out faster. The last of the stored grain had turned rancid. Every man, woman, and child resembled a skeletal horror. Hollow-eyed and sunken-cheeked, with hair falling out in clumps and skin the color of damp parchment. It's around this time that mass graves began to appear. hand-dug pit in the frozen ground, sometimes filled with snow to keep the smell down. There was no ceremony, no priestly blessing. The bodies were tossed in like garbage, because in practical terms, that's what they were. You couldn't afford to waste time or precious wood on individual burials when there were mouths still breathing and possibly worth keeping alive. And what about medicine? Oh, bless your optimistic heart. Medieval medical care in a famine was essentially a grim comedy of errors. Barber surgeons, those cheerful psychopaths with their bloodletting bowls and rusted bone saws, were in short supply, either dead themselves or too busy trying to saw frozen limbs off frostbite victims. The local wise woman might prescribe a poultice made from moss and goose fat, or a tea of boiled willow bark. Effective, debatable, psychologically reassuring? Maybe. Some particularly unhinged towns tried magical solutions, warding spells, protective amulets, charms made from bits of dead animals. There are records of villagers hanging desiccated weasel corpses above their doors to scare off hunger spirits. Unsurprisingly, this did nothing to improve the situation, but did provide scavenging crows with a convenient snack. Meanwhile, the psychological strain began to show. Hallucinations were common. Starving villagers swore they saw tables laden with roasted meat and fresh bread, only to lunge forwards and bite into a clump of frozen mud. Tales of hunger madness spread, a temporary insanity where sufferers would attack their families, flee naked into the snow, or drop dead mid-sentence. The line between survival and madness blurred until no one could quite tell who was still sane. And then there was organized cannibalism. The unthinkable became thinkable. Desperation makes philosophers of us all, and medieval peasants faced with extinction debated the moral logistics of eating the dead. Was it a sin if the person had already died? Did it matter if you didn't kill them first? Should you prioritize strangers over kin? Historians have found chronicled debates on these questions, which suggests that yes, there were actual town meetings where half-starved peasants sat around, argued theology, and quietly decided who might taste best. And make no mistake, they made their choices. In some villages, outsiders, passing travelers, beggars, those without family, were the first to vanish. Then the sick, the elderly, and those considered morally suspect. Gossip and old grudges resurfaced as survival strategy. Remember old Martin who allegedly stole a chicken 3 years ago? Well, maybe it's time to hold him accountable. In the most infamous cases, lots were drawn, and the condemned were ritually killed for the good of the community. These horrors weren't unique to one place or one century. From the Great Famine of the 1310s to localized disasters throughout medieval Europe, countless records hint at atrocities carried out beneath the snow. Chroniclers were often discreet, couching their reports in euphemism. The people consumed unmentionable meats. The weak were put to use. The flesh of men was traded like beef. It was understood. It didn't need to be said outright. And yet, amidst this hellscape, life persisted in its bleak, shivering way. Infants still wailed in freezing cradles. The church bell rang to mark the Angelus, though its tone was flat and defeated. Lovers met in secret, seeking warmth in each other's arms, if nothing else. Even in the depths of famine, some fool inevitably tried to brew beer from spoiled grain, producing a foul, sour liquid that doubled as disinfectant and suicidal coping mechanism. The village's handful of surviving animals, maybe a goat or two, a stray pig, were jealously guarded. You didn't eat them because if you did, there was truly no hope left. They were mascots, grim symbols of a future you no longer believed in. Small children were told tales of an impending spring, though by now no one really believed it. Hope was an indulgence, like clean water or teeth, and finally there was fire. In a world of endless white, fire was color, life, and defiance. Villagers scavenged wood from abandoned homes, ripped fences from frozen fields, even burned church pews. Bonfires were built, not for celebration, but simply to remind themselves that warmth was still a thing that existed. Gathered around the crackling flames, skeletal faces flickering orange and black, the survivors whispered their dead's names, cursed the snows, and waited for something, anything, to change. It was a form of magic in itself, those fires, a last stand against the endless night. And still, winter wasn't done with them yet. By March, if you were still alive, you'd made it to what medieval chroniclers poetically dubbed the Starvation weeks. Not because people hadn't been starving for months already, but because now, at long last, everyone was openly admitting it. The snow had turned into gray, slushy rivers of filth. The ground was still frozen solid, but the days grew fractionally longer. It was that grotesque liminal season where hope teased you like a schoolyard bully, dangling a crust of bread just out of reach. At this stage, the village wasn't so much a functioning community as a collection of gaunt, twitching scarecrows, quietly resenting one another's continued existence. The social contract had completely disintegrated. The Lord's Manor was now a fortified island in a sea of human misery. Its remaining guards posted at the gates, nervously watching for torch-wielding peasants with nothing left to lose. Inside, the Lord's table still groaned under the weight of salted pork and preserved apples, because even in a famine, the ruling class somehow always managed to have pie. And the church? Oh, they were still there, of course. Priests delivered increasingly desperate sermons about patience, sacrifice, and eternal reward. Nothing inspires confidence quite like a sunken-eyed clergyman in a frostbitten cassock assuring you that heaven makes up for all this. They organized mass prayers, processions, and even relic displays. You haven't truly experienced medieval futility until you've spent 3 hours in the snow watching an old man wave around the alleged fingerbone of Saint Erasmus in hopes it'll scare away hunger. The land itself, however, was not cooperating. Famine winters had a way of hanging on long after their welcome had expired. Even as the calendar insisted it was spring, the fields remained barren. Frozen mud cracked beneath your feet. Nothing sprouted. The livestock that hadn't been eaten by December were either dead or little more than diseased bone piles festering near the tree line. And speaking of the tree line, venturing into the woods for foraging was now an act of suicidal bravado. Starving wolves, packs of feral dogs, and equally desperate neighboring villagers roamed those woods. There's something especially horrifying about getting killed by a rival peasant over a handful of half-rotten acorns. But in March, that was just Tuesday. If a villager did manage to drag something back, a withered root, a clutch of bird eggs, a dead weasel, it was treated like treasure. Villages had essentially reverted to a barter economy, run entirely on whatever horrifying scraps people could scavenge. A bundle of dry sticks might be traded for a boiled mouse, an old boot sole for a spoonful of rancid lard. You learned quickly not to ask where any of it came from. Disease, meanwhile, was having the time of its life. Famine didn't just kill with hunger. It opened the door for every miserable infection known to medieval man. Dysentery, typhoid, and ergotism, the infamous holy fire, caused by moldy rye bread, swept through villages like opportunistic vultures. The symptoms were a comedy of horrors: vomiting, hallucinations, gangrenous limbs, and in some cases, limbs literally falling off in the snow. The most cheerful ailment was probably famine edema, also known as dropsy. Your body, deprived of any meaningful nutrition, would swell grotesquely with fluid retention. Imagine a skeleton balloon slowly inflating, your limbs bloated, and your skin stretched so thin it might split at any moment. Historians describe victims barely able to move, faces so distorted they became unrecognizable. Honestly, it was the medieval equivalent of turning into a waterlogged zombie. Meanwhile, the collective psyche of the surviving villagers fractured into a kind of communal madness. There are documented cases of people claiming to hear voices from beneath the snow. Entire families were known to barricade themselves indoors, certain the dead were knocking on their doors. Religious paranoia reached cartoonish levels. People accused each other of consorting with demons, hiding secret food caches, or deliberately cursing the harvest. Witch hunts, always a favorite medieval pastime, saw a resurgence, and the scapegoating didn't stop there. Ethnic minorities, wandering beggars, and traveling merchants were blamed for everything, from crop blight to dead livestock. In some towns, desperate mobs seized suspected outsiders and executed them in grotesque public displays, convinced this would lift whatever curse hung over their fields. It didn't, but it made the survivors feel marginally better, which, let's be honest, was probably the real point. Then came the children. The famine winter was particularly merciless to the young. By March, it was common for villages to have lost half their children to hunger, disease, or exposure. Infants were the first to go, their tiny bodies no match for freezing nights and an empty breast. Slightly older kids who'd once scampered through the fields now sat listlessly in corners, ribs poking through their skin, too weak to even beg. And here's where things get truly medieval. Children weren't just victims, they became currency. Starving families might sell a child to a slightly less desperate neighbor in exchange for food or fuel. The church, keen to rack up salvation points, occasionally took in orphans, though it was less about charity and more about having extra hands to tend the monastery gardens come spring. In the worst cases, children were actively sacrificed in those grim, whispered acts of community, cannibalism no one dared write about openly. There's a particularly grim record from 14th century Lorraine describing a village where children drew lots to decide who would be sent into the woods to forage, fully aware the chosen child would never return. It was the medieval equivalent of a horror film, a slow, desperate narrowing of options until human decency cracked like ice underfoot. But of course, famine winters didn't affect everyone equally. The nobility and merchant class had their own strategies for dealing with the season's horrors. Lords fled to their fortified castles with their private stockpiles of salted game, dried fruit, and imported spices. City dwellers hoarded what little food remained behind barricaded doors. If peasants from the countryside approached seeking aid, they were often turned away, or worse, killed to prevent looting. And in cities, things were no less apocalyptic. Urban centers during a famine winter were petri dishes of disease, violence, and despair. Bread riots broke out as bakers sold their last loaves at 10 times the price. Corpses piled up in the streets, rats swarmed markets and abandoned homes. One 1316 account from Paris describes people reduced to eating the straw from their roofs and boiling the soles of their shoes. Desperation gave way to absurdity. In one English village, records tell of a priest who preached that burying a black rooster alive at midnight would summon a demon who'd reveal the location of hidden food. Apparently, it didn't work, unless you count the rooster's suffering as a culinary victory. And yet, through all of this, tiny acts of human stubbornness persisted. A half-starved mother wrapping her child in scraps of wool, a priest risking his life to steal a loaf of bread for a dying parishioner, a peasant crafting a crude flute from a hollow bone and playing it by firelight. These moments didn't change the grand, merciless arc of the famine, but they proved that even in a world reduced to savagery, people clung to flickers of dignity. By late March, the world began to shift. The ice retreated, streams gurgled beneath the snow, crocus flowers poked through the filthy drifts like pale, defiant middle fingers to the long winter. The air no longer stung your lungs quite so violently. Birds returned, tentatively at first, then in chattering flocks, but the damage was done. Villages that had once housed 200 souls now held 40. Whole family lines vanished. The social hierarchy shattered. Old alliances meant nothing. The survivors were gaunt, paranoid wretches with frostbite scars and haunted eyes. And of course, as soon as the ground thawed, the real work began. There were fields to replant, livestock to replace, bodies to bury, and taxes, always taxes. Lords sent their men to demand arrears, indifferent to the state of the survivors. The church, never one to miss a beat, imposed Thanksgiving tithes for the end of the famine. And people paid, because what else could they do? The fields had to be sown. Life, or something resembling it, had to resume. In time, the memories of that nightmare winter would fade. New children would be born, songs would be sung. The harvest might improve, but no one ever truly forgot. There was a look, a certain shadow behind the eyes of those who'd survived a famine winter. A hard, unspoken knowledge that under the right circumstances, you might eat your neighbor. That firewood is worth more than loyalty. That hope, when it finally returns, comes far too late. And so, as spring crept over the land, green tendrils unfurling in fields still littered with bones, the medieval world did what it always did. It buried its dead, told itself it would never happen again, and carried on. By April, those lucky enough, or unlucky enough, to have survived the famine, winter looked like the walking dead. Skin hanging loose from bone, teeth lost to scurvy, eyes sunken so deep they seemed to vanish entirely into skull sockets. The village wasn't so much a community anymore as a loose collection of traumatized survivors too exhausted to hate each other properly, which, by medieval standards, meant things were starting to improve. Spring, of course, was no guarantee of salvation. The medieval world, in its infinite pettiness, enjoyed one final joke: the hungry gap. You see, while the snow might melt and the air warm, there still wasn't any actual food. Winter stores were gone, livestock dead, the earliest vegetables wouldn't sprout for weeks, so famine dragged on like an unwelcome party guest who refuses to leave even after you've extinguished the candles and started cleaning up the bloodstains. At this point, the already ghastly diet hit bold new lows. Surviving villagers scraped lichen from rocks. They chewed raw grass like desperate cows. They boiled dock leaves and nettles, turning them into a sour, bitter slurry that promised little more than diarrhea and faint, fleeting hope. Anything remotely edible was devoured, including frogs, snails, and the occasional unguarded family cat. This is also when the worst famine superstitions bloomed like some particularly wretched fungus. Medieval villagers, never ones to let a crisis go without inventing new ways to blame each other, clung to the belief that some among them possessed the evil eye, an invisible curse capable of ruining crops, curdling milk, and making your last turnip rot in the ground. Accusations were tossed around like wildfire. Widow Marjorie's baby died. Clearly her neighbor was a witch. The priest's ox keeled over. Must be the cobbler's doing. These weren't idle accusations. A famine was a fine excuse for a witch trial, and in the absence of proper courts or anyone who gave a damn about due process, justice was typically delivered via mob. Suspects were tossed into rivers to see if they floated. Spoiler: in ice melt runoff, nobody floated, and yet, somehow the mere act of execution served to lift spirits. If nothing else, it gave people something to do besides starve. Meanwhile, religious processions only grew more elaborate. Having exhausted their supply of regular relics and saints' toenails, churches resorted to parading increasingly questionable artifacts: a feather allegedly plucked from the angel Gabriel's wing, a rock supposedly kissed by St. Cuthbert. Villagers, too hungry to care about authenticity, flocked to these displays. They knelt in the mud, prayed fervently, and secretly hoped someone would drop a crust of bread. Famine also meant reckoning with the dead. By spring, the mass graves dug hastily during the winter had become waterlogged, foul-smelling pits. Bodies that hadn't frozen solid had decayed grotesquely. And remember, this was an era before germ theory. Villagers believed disease rose from bad air and miasmas, which meant that rotting corpses were an urgent priority, but only insofar as moving them a few feet away from the nearest footpath. More organized communities sent teams of survivors to rebury the dead in hastily consecrated pits farther from the village center. They'd perform rushed rites, sometimes led by exhausted, half-mad priests, sometimes not at all. In one particularly bleak case recorded in a 14th century French chronicle, the village simply burned the entire burial ground, bodies and all, in a final desperate attempt to ward off lingering death. It didn't work, but at least it gave them a brief, warm bonfire to gather around. Meanwhile, famine survivors had to deal with the consequences of everything they'd done to survive. The theft, the betrayal, the cannibalism. Villages bore grudges like medieval currency. It was not uncommon for vendettas from a famine winter to persist for generations. If your great-grandfather allegedly stole bread from Widow Agnes during the famine of 1316, you might still find yourself mysteriously excluded from harvest festivals a century later, and then came the tax collectors. Yes, even after a winter of death, starvation, and moral collapse, the nobility still expected their dues. Lords sent their reeves and bailiffs to scrape what they could from the broken remains of their villages. Unable to collect in grain or livestock, they took tools, land rights, daughters for servitude, or pressed the healthiest remaining men into military service. Nothing says thank you for surviving quite like being conscripted into a war against the neighboring barony over who technically owns a marsh. The church, naturally, demanded tithes too. You might have buried your entire family last month and eaten moss to stay alive, but God still wanted his cut. Failing to pay meant excommunication, which in medieval terms was spiritual and social death, a fate many considered worse than starvation itself. Some monks at least offered soup kitchens. These, however, were as much PR stunt as charity, ensuring the local abbey kept its good name while distributing thin gruel that tasted mostly of defeat. And while famine was often a local disaster, word of particularly bad winters spread. Medieval Europe loved a good horror story. Merchants, minstrels, and clergy carried tales of desperate cannibals and cursed villages across the land. The more grotesque the detail, eyes eaten from corpses, children roasted on spits, the more eagerly it was repeated. Chroniclers compiled these accounts in great ledgers, occasionally embellishing them until the line between fact and famine fiction blurred into one long, blood-soaked cautionary tale. Ironically, these stories served a practical purpose. They were morality plays, warning future generations to pray harder, obey authority, and always keep a suspicious eye on their neighbors. And like all morality tales, the unspoken message was this: it could happen again. And it did. Famine winters returned with bleak regularity. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was followed by lesser but still lethal disasters throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. Sometimes it was rain, sometimes drought, sometimes war trampled crops and salted fields, and of course in 1347 the Black Death arrived, which made every previous famine look like an overly long brunch. Yet despite everything, medieval villages rebuilt, slowly, grudgingly. New houses rose on the ashes of old ones. Fresh fields were plowed where mass graves lay beneath. Babies were born. The world, indifferent as ever, kept spinning. And within a few years, the horrors of that particular winter faded into uneasy memory. Famine winters became stories told by firesides, half-remembered warnings passed from grandmother to child, of the man who ate his own hand, of the widow who traded her youngest for a sack of grain, of the family that locked themselves in their home and were found months later, gnawed down to the bone. Children shivered at these tales, never quite sure whether they were true. The old ones never confirmed or denied, because everyone knew the truth. It had happened before, and it could happen again. Modern readers, you sitting there with your electric lights and your emergency snack drawer, might think yourself safely removed from this world, but the bones of those famine winters still lie beneath your feet. Every village, every patch of European countryside holds the unmarked graves of the starved and the eaten, their names forgotten, their stories reduced to cautionary folklore. Yet their suffering shaped the world we inherited, because that's the final grim punchline to all of this. We're here because they endured it, not because they triumphed, not because of some indomitable spirit, simply because a handful of them, through luck, ruthlessness, or sheer animal stubbornness, managed to crawl through the horror and breed. The medieval world didn't offer lessons. It didn't care if you learned anything. It didn't hand out redemption. It just killed you, or let you live long enough to bury someone else. So the next time you casually toss out a stale sandwich or complain about being hangry, remember that you come from a long, miserable line of famine survivors who would have happily boiled your shoes and eaten your belt. The world they lived in was a frozen, starving, bone-scattered hellscape of superstition, betrayal, and unthinkable choices. And you, fortunate, soft, well-fed creature that you are, should thank your ancestors every single day for their unholy resilience, because if you'd been there, you wouldn't have made it a week. Hey, ever thought your flu symptoms were bad? Imagine trusting your life to a barber surgeon whose primary medical tool is a rusty blade and a prayer to Saint Fiacre. Welcome to medieval winter healthcare. In the dead of December, when snow silenced the fields and bitter winds turned breath into frost, peasant cottages became both clinic and catastrophe. The village healer, usually the elderly widow Marjorie or the itinerant barber surgeon who showed up once a season, was armed with little more than folklore, a mortar and pestle, and a dubious grimoire of remedies. No hospitals, no licensed MDs, just you, your feverish cough, and a cauldron of half-rotted herbs bubbling over the hearth. Your first sign of illness might be a drizzling fever, a chill that no blanket could chase away, or a sudden toothache so severe you'd swear your molar had been possessed by a winter demon. The remedy? Clenching a lump of raw garlic or jabbing your gums with a silver needle. If you could even find silver in a peasant's purse. More often, Marjorie would blend whatever she could scavenge. Sprigs of rosemary for cleansing the humors, a pinch of yarrow to staunch bleeding, and the root of comfrey, rumored to knit broken bones and, according to some, mend shattered souls. Brewing these potions was an art of extremes. Herbs were collected on pilgrimage-like treks through frostbitten forests, no small feat when wolves lurked in the shadows, and the path itself threatened to swallow you in snowdrifts. Roots stuffed into burlap sacks froze solid, so the healer often kicked them against the hearth to break them apart, scattering fragments across the floor like botanical confetti. Then came the mortar and pestle, wooden bowls that saw more disease than centuries of use should allow. The peasant's kitchen, once a place of simple porridge and ale, transformed into a bubbling laboratory where lizards' claws, dried leech heads, and bats' wings might jostle alongside rosemary and mint. Once the concoction was ready, the next step was ingestion, or application. Poultices of mustard seed and honey were smeared across chests to draw out the phlegm, a trick that often left blisters so severe farmers mistook them for frostbite. Fomentations, cloths soaked in hot vinegar and pepper, were wrapped around aching joints, causing steam and screams that echoed through the rafters. Those who endured won bragging rights at the next village feast. Those who refused were branded cowards or accused of coddling themselves like noble-born. But for many, the deadliest winter ailment wasn't a cough or ache, it was scurvy. Without fresh vegetables, vitamin C was as rare as a proper roof over your head. Marjorie's solution involved concocting sour ale by adding pine needles or juniper berries to the brewer's kettle. Drunk in small doses, it reportedly prevented bleeding gums and rotten teeth, though more than a few villagers ended up with stomach cramps so violent they spent the night praying for mercy. Then there was the plague of coughs, a phlegmy hack that rattled your chest like a war drum. The common cure: inhaling the smoke of burning juniper or heather in a clay pot. You'd crouch over the smoke, a blanket over your head like a makeshift tent, and breathe in until tears streamed down your face. Some swore this cleared their lungs. Others claimed it was merely a painful distraction. The most extreme cases called for bleeding, a practice still beloved in medieval medicine. Barber surgeons carried curved razors and small bowls to catch your precious red life juice. They'd tie a tourniquet above the elbow, carve a shallow slit, and let fate decide how much fluid to release. Excess humors slipped away, they said. Balance was restored. In reality, you left sapped and dizzy, wondering if your bones were made of ice or pulp. Children, the most vulnerable of winter's victims, faced their own horrors. Ear infections were whispered to be caused by mischievous elves nesting in the ear canal. The cure? Inserting a smoldering twig, hoping to burn the elf free, a gamble that often led to singed eardrums and deafness. Those who survived infantile fevers were paraded through the village naked at dawn to shock the disease from their bodies, a public spectacle as mortifying as it was ineffective. Worse still was the fear of sweating sickness and consumption, early names for illnesses that today might map to influenza or tuberculosis. Once symptoms surfaced, night sweats, bloody spit, relentless coughs, no remedy truly helped. Patients were isolated in outdoor huts called pest houses, where they lay on straw beds, clothed only in linen shifts, watched over by acolytes too terrified to come close. Neighbors left bowls of thin gruel at the door and ran away, convinced that mere proximity could condemn them. All the while, Christian piety intertwined with medicine. Prayers were chanted over the sick, icons of saints known for healing, Saint Blay for throat ailments, Saint Roche for plague victims, were pressed to fevered foreheads. Some villagers pinned pieces of cloth touched to holy relics to their bodies, hoping the saint's miracle might rub off. When miracles failed, blame followed. Patients were accused of harboring sin or consorting with witches, and healers risked being burned alongside their cursed remedies. Yet, for all its brutality, this primitive medicine sometimes worked. Herbs with genuine antimicrobial properties, thyme, sage, and garlic, did offer relief. Rest by the hearth, forced idleness, and a little kindness from family members boosted recovery odds. And every winter, a few lucky souls staggered out of their cottages in spring, alive, though hollow-eyed and forever changed. Through it all, peasant medicine was a testament to human ingenuity under fire, or frost. With no clinics, no pharmaceuticals, and no guarantee of survival, these medieval healers cobbled together every scrap of knowledge they could find. They learned which herbs soothed coughs, which roots staunched wounds, and which potions merely killed more hopeful patrons. Their successes and failures became folklore, passed down at hearthside gatherings when the fiercest winds howled outside, reminding each listener that life, however tenuous, was still worth fighting for. By late December, the alehouse's warm glow felt like a miracle, until you realized the ale was a thin, sour beer brewed from spoiled barley and pine needles designed to ward off scurvy but tasting like tree sap gone rancid. Still, you gulped it down because what's worse, bleeding gums or gagging on holiday cheer? When frostbitten toes turned from pink to black, the peasant cure was unapologetically medieval, a poultice of fat rendered from sheep suet mixed with crushed peppercorns. Slather it thick, wrap in linen, and pray the pepper burns away the dead flesh. If you survived the pain, sometimes the frostbite receded. If not, you'd spend spring hopping about on one foot and scuffing the other like a mournful barn dance. None of this deterred the local barber surgeon, who rinsed his razors in river water and bragged that amputation was a small price to pay for warmth. Coughs persisted, hacking through the night as children shivered under bed mats stuffed with straw. The villagers' go-to remedy was an herbal syrup of mullein leaves boiled in honey, an expensive commodity even in good times. Marjorie pilfered honey from the church beehives, a sin that could earn you a slap on the wrist or a month in the stocks, depending on the vicar's mood. Still, giving a child a spoonful of the dark, viscous concoction often brought enough comfort to still the rattling chest long enough for sleep. Fevers remained the deadliest threat. Without microscopes or thermometers, diagnosis relied on ritual. The healer would lay a warm, damp cloth on your brow to read the sweat. If it ran down your cheeks in thick rivulets, you were deemed burnt by the internal fire and subject to aggressive treatments. These included a heated metal cautery iron pressed to the skin to release the evil spirit of fever. The ordeal left circular burn scars on arms and legs, literal badges of suffering worn long after the patient recovered. Potion making was its own catastrophe. A popular brew combined nightshade berries, potentially fatal, with wine and a dash of arsenic to balance the humors. One sip too many and you risked death by poisoning, rather than the original illness. Yet healers argued that a bold toxin could jolt the body back to equilibrium, a theory as scientific as tossing dice. Villagers often sneaked extra doses in hopes of a quick cure, only to double their funeral expenses. Joint pain and arthritis were shrugged off as old age afflictions, even when they struck 30-year-olds. The cure? A liniment made of boiled goose fat and juniper resin, massaged deep into the joints after a bone-chilling soak in a makeshift bath warmed by hot stones. There were tales of brave souls submerging themselves in cold streams, then rolling in the snow to shock the pain away, a practice that sounds more like torture than therapy. Yet, in a world without aspirin, any relief was worthy of legend. Gout, the rich man's disease, found its way into peasant hands thanks to the new winter wine trade. When toes swelled and joints throbbed, sufferers applied crushed gooseberries and nettle leaf to the affected area, believing the astringent qualities would draw out the excess fluids. Some villagers chewed on willow bark for pain, effectively inventing their own primitive aspirin. Let's just say the results were variable, and many dealt with the agony by swaying in hammocks of rope in a drunken stupor, courtesy of the pine needle stout. Eye infections flared in the bone-chilling wind, and treatments ranged from the mild, soaking linen bandages in rosewater, to the extreme, placing copper coins on the eyelids to cauterize the inflammation under moonlight. The latter often caused chemical burns as green verdigris mixed with tears, leaving patients half-blind until spring. Midwives warned against these practices, but who could argue with a glinting penny when your sight blurred? Then came the madness of little death fevers, likely influenza. Villagers believed the plague of coughs could be prevented by smoking tobacco leaves in communal chambers, tobacco having arrived from the New World only decades earlier. Feather-stuffed pillows were burned atop hearthstones, filling huts with choking smoke that made everyone gasp for breath. If you survived the smoke, the lack of fresh air sometimes killed more than the illness itself. Wounds, when they happened, often thanks to frozen axes or wayward pitchforks, posed another horror. A simple cut risked infection so severe that amputation was sometimes the only remedy. Healers used cow dung poultices, believing the warmth and bacteria would speed healing. In truth, it introduced virulent infection, and patients often begged for the blade once the stench became unbearable. Surgeons lapped up the treatment as evidence of their skill when a wound miraculously closed. Those deemed beyond save fought for last rites rather than last remedies. The dying were laid on straw mats by the hearth, surrounded by neighbors chanting psalms and fanning the meager flames. In their final moments, some clutched amulets, bones of the blessed, nails from the true cross, while priests muttered absolutions soaked in incense smoke. When the soul departed, the body remained, a hollow shell no remedy could mend. Yet, amid this carousel of pain, knowledge grew. Marjorie's children took notes, scraps of parchment jammed between floorboards, and passed down effective recipes: chamomile tea to calm fevers, elderberry syrup to tame coughs, nettle infusions to relieve arthritis. Over generations, these practices refined, laying the groundwork for future apothecaries. Even in the darkest, coldest months, tiny victories emerged. A child cured of croup by a garlic poultice, a frostbite survivor walking again after multiple cautery sessions, a family spared scurvy by hoarding enough pine needle ale. By midwinter, the village's ragged survivors bore testament to the power of desperation and human creativity. Their bodies and souls were marked by haphazard treatments, some barbaric, some surprisingly effective, but all born of a simple need: to see spring's green return with lungs unfilled by smoke, wounds uninfected, and spirits not yet broken. And though medieval medicine was often a roll of the dice with your mortality, it was these primitive remedies that stitched communities back together, hearth by hearth, one jar of comfrey salve at a time. By midwinter's bleakest nights, the line between illness and death sentence all but vanished. In Part 3, we followed the peasant village as it battles the full onslaught of winter diseases, with nothing but folklore, frostbitten hope, and a mortar that's seen better centuries. By January's end, chills weren't just a symptom, they were a state of being. Even the hardiest souls shivered through their woolen tunics, teeth chattering echoes in empty halls. When a cough took hold, it rattled like an iron grate in your chest. The village healer, let's call her Marjorie, though there were 20 Marjories in Europe, prescribed her signature draught, a heady mix of elderflowers, juniper berries, and a splash of ale to open the pores. In practice, this tasted like you, fermented your laundry. But villagers swallowed it anyway, convinced even poison of any kind might beat the alternative. Then there was the raging cold, a term they used for frostbite so severe it crept up beyond fingers and toes. Treatment was a ritual of pain. The patient was stripped to the waist, limbs rubbed vigorously with a blend of goose fat and ground pepper, then wrapped in steaming blankets. Screams from these pepper baths were said to scare away the cold spirits, but locals admitted privately that many wounds turned gangrenous. The pepper merely masked the rot until apocalyptic fevers set in. Speaking of fevers, one spikes above a boiling pot, the high burning flush that left faces glowing like embers. The next step was bloodletting. Barber surgeons arrived with a kit of crude lancets and wooden cups. With a swift slash to the arm, they drained what they called corrupt humors into shallow bowls. Villagers believed in 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and that too much of anyone led to disease. So bleeding was a reset button. In reality, it often turned mild ailments into irreversible weakness. But hey, science marches on, or at least meanders badly. Respiratory illnesses, croup, pneumonia, early tuberculosis, spread like wildfire in crowded cottages. The cure du jour was a smoke tent. The sick huddled beneath an upturned tub rimmed with damp cloths, while a blend of juniper, yarrow, and sulphurous brimstone was set ablaze beneath them. The choking fumes were meant to purge the lungs. Survivors emerged blinking, eyes red and streaming, lungs as scorched as the soot-blackened ceiling, and a new respect for fresh air, if you could only risk the bitter wind outside. Scurvy, that bone-gnawing plague of vitamin deficiency, was still a winter constant. Marjorie's answer lay in concocting a pine needle infusion. She boiled spruce tips in water until the brew turned a sickly olive color, then forced villagers to sip it. Some claimed its piney tang cleared gum ulcers. Others ended up with stomach cramps so severe they begged for snow to numb the agony. But miraculous or miserable, consumption of leached C vitamins likely saved more teeth and lives than any prayer. Yet the most dreaded affliction was the shaking sickness, perhaps influenza at its cruelest. Onset was sudden, chills so deep you couldn't stop shaking even under 6 blankets, followed by delirium that had victims ranting about dragons or dancing in their own blood. Homes became makeshift pest houses, straw-strewn huts at the village edge, where the sick lay naked, gibbering, while relatives peered through cracks, flinging in bowls of gruel and whispering last rites. Mortality soared. Neighbors spoke in fearful hush. Once the shaking comes, no healer nor saint can save you. Smallpox, though they had no name for it, added its terror, red pustules blooming on the skin like cursed flowers. Treatment was a peat ash poultice, applied thickly to draw out the poison. Cautery iron seared scorch marks around pustules to protect the spread. Survivors bore pockmarked faces, but at least the wounds didn't reopen. Those who died were burned with their bedding to stop contagion, producing bonfires that lit the sky like ominous beacons of despair. In these darkest weeks, childbirth became a gamble with the reaper. Freezing temperatures and malnourished mothers made even the sturdiest infants perilously weak. Midwives who usually relied on soothing herbs now mixed yarrow, plantain, and angelica in steam baths, hoping to hasten labor and staunch hemorrhaging. If the mother survived, the baby emerged wailing, a triumph worthy of feast day bonfires. If not, the village dug a shallow grave in frozen earth and moved on before the smell could spread. Maladies of the mind rose too. Winter madness, melancholia fueled by isolation, hunger, and the endless howl of wind, led to confessions of spectral torment. Locals swore they saw ghosts of past victims peering from snowdrifts, beckoning them to wander off and join the dead. The wise men tried exorcisms. They drove the afflicted into the woods at dawn, chased them with torches, and dragged them back screaming. Witch hunts flared as villagers blamed each other's misfortunes on curses. Accused sorcerers sometimes got lucky and escaped. More often, they got dunked in icy streams until the village decided they were witches, unless they drowned first. Through it all, faith coped as badly as medicine. Chapels held impromptu cold light vigils where acolytes read psalms by candlelight. Crowds squeezed inside, stomping snow from boots, hoping the warmth of bodies might ward off chills. Holy water froze on the font, roofs iced over, and priests donned extra wool under their robes. They anointed the sick with oil from miracle lamps, said to burn since the martyr Thomas's day. A dubious claim, but the ritual comforted some. As February waned, the harrowing spectacle shifted only slightly. The sick either recovered, leaving skeleton frames too frail for full health, or they perished, their bodies carted to mass graves. Fields outside the village brimmed with abandoned grave mounds. Scavengers, ravens, foxes, the occasional desperate shepherd dog, picked bones clean, the skeletons bleaching in patchy sunlight like grim totems. Yet in this crucible of suffering, knowledge crept forward. Marjorie's apprentice, a curious lad with calloused hands and a head for scraps of parchment, began noting what worked. Chamomile tea helped settle fevers. Willow bark chew soothed joint pain. Elderberry syrup cut coughs. These bits of wisdom spread like wildfire in surviving villages, carried by travelers and traders who'd once dismissed peasant lore as crude superstition. By the time spring dared approach, these primitive remedies formed the foundations of future apothecaries, and so, as February surrendered to March's thaw, the village faced its final winter test, the return of daylight with no food to match. But that is part 4's tale. For now, remember, medieval peasants may have lacked stethoscopes and syringes, but they fought winter illnesses with every scrap of folklore, every blistering pepper poultice, and every prayer they knew, because to perish without trying was unthinkable even in a world this merciless. By the time March's thaw teased muddy puddles through frozen ruts, the village's weathered survivors stood at a grim crossroads. Behind them lay months of coughing fits, fever dreams, and the gnawing fear that any day might be their last. Ahead lay the hungry gap, a cruel limbo before fields finally greened, when empty stomachs still ruled, and spring's promise felt like a betrayal. But first, there were last-ditch remedies, reckonings with the damage done, and a desperate scramble to prepare for the weeks yet to come. One of the final winter scourges was wind sickness, a vague catch-all for chills that rallied anew whenever a gust howled through cracked walls. Healers prescribed airproofing rituals. Villagers daubed mud plaster inside window cracks, draped heavy furs over doors, and stuffed straw into every crevice. Then they stood before the hearth, arms akimbo, chanting protective verses while blackened torches flickered overhead. The result? Damp straw that sprouted mold, foul-smelling air that triggered new coughs, and the unmistakable sensation of being trapped in a human-sized beehive. But tradition held sway. If the cold returned, at least they could point fingers at an ancient rite. When the sunlight finally pierced through broken shutters, frostbite survivors braved exposure more willingly than before. They gathered around the hearth in ragged clusters, passing around bowls of mustard seed oil to massage into scarred flesh. The ritual was as communal as it was painful. Each person knelt in turn, limbs quivering, while neighbors fussed, whispered encouragements, and pinched cheeks to stave off fainting. Those who survived the massage often emerged with new scars, braided patterns etched into skin that marked them as veterans of winter's cruelty. Scar tissue was also the legacy of cautery irons, blistering circles pressed into swollen joints to divert maladies. Now, as spring approached, villagers held iron release ceremonies to mark the end of those brutal treatments. Healers hauled their irons outdoors, boiled them in vinegar baths, then passed them through smoke and flame to cleanse the instrument's soul. Locals watched in silence as each iron glowed, imagining the evicted maladies flickering off into the sky. Some scoffed at the pageantry, but in a world governed by superstition, the drama offered solace that steel alone never could. Meanwhile, the last of the pest houses emptied. Survivors of consumption and shaking sickness shuffled back into community life, eyes haunted but bodies intact. They carried with them reed baskets woven from birch bark, each bundle containing a sprig of rosemary, a sachet of crushed thyme, and a carved bone token, amulets against future illness. Newly immune or merely fortunate, they claimed these talismans protected against winter ills, even as they tucked them alongside family heirlooms. The tokens multiplied, passed among neighbors in hopeful exchange, embedding themselves in the village's material culture as quiet reminders of winter's lessons. Yet the very act of crafting these cures and charms was its own contagion. Every herb sifter, mortar pounder, and salve spreader risked exposure to lingering contagions. Apprentices who cleaned out cauldrons learned to wear linen gloves soaked in vinegar, a rudimentary antiseptic, long before anyone named its germ-fighting power. The vinegar muffled the scent of rot and supposedly killed evil spirits, making it a staple in every cure. Over time, the practice spread beyond healers. Householders used vinegar washes to sterilize cooking pots, and mothers applied vinegary cloths to infant fevers, unwittingly laying groundwork for modern disinfection. Grudges, too, hung in the air thick as smoke. Those blamed for botched remedies. Marjorie's son, who'd harvested belladonna too early, causing a rash of delirium. The barber surgeon, who severed more veins than necessary, found themselves met with pointed stares. Villagers whispered of revenge cures, planting cursed gourds in a rival's field, or mixing bitter yew leaf into communal brew. When spring sowing began, herb gardens became battlegrounds for these petty vendettas. Some found their handful of thyme seeds replaced by weeds. Others discovered their comfrey crop mysteriously trampled. Even as they sought new life from the soil, old animosities rooted themselves deeper. But spring's return carried a tangible delight. Fresh greens, albeit meager, began poking through thawed earth. Dandelion leaves, chickweed, and early sorrel offered crude but vital nutrients. Healers led foraging expeditions, guiding villagers to hidden hollows where nettles and wild garlic thrived. Each handful was celebrated, boiled into bitter broths that turned tongues black but filled bellies enough to revive spirits. Children learned to recognize edible shoots, their fingers stained green and eyes bright with the thrill of finding nature's hidden larder. With the arrival of these greens, scurvy's grip finally loosened. Old wounds sealed, gums firmed, and sallow complexions brightened. The village marked this turning point with the green feast, a modest meal of boiled nettle soup garnished with foraged herbs. No salt, no spices, just the earthy bitterness of spring's first gifts. Attendees whispered prayers of thanks, each ladleful swallowed with a newfound reverence for the simplest ingredients. The feast was hardly a celebration of abundance, but rather a solemn acknowledgement that survival, however partial, was nothing short of a miracle. Lessons from winter's medical horrors lingered in those gathered faces. Apprentices compiled their notes into rudimentary leech scrolls, cloaked manuscripts bound in treated hide. These scrolls cataloged cures that had coaxed survivors through the darkness: elderberry for coughs, chamomile for fevers, poultices of plantain for wounds. They noted which concoctions had failed patients outright, warning future healers of nightshade's deadly potency when mismeasured in the folly of arsenic-laced drafts. Though literacy was rare, these texts passed by word of mouth, becoming part of an oral tradition that blended fact and superstition in equal measure. As planting began, the village turned its collective ingenuity toward health prevention. Herb gardens sprouted beside every cottage, each plot a patchwork of medicinal plants: rue to ward off pestilence, lavender to calm nerves, hyssop to purify stagnant air. Fences were built around these gardens, not just to keep out rabbits, but to signal the sacred purpose within. Children were taught, before they could read, the shapes and scents of each plant. Knowledge transferred at dawn, while dew clung to leaves and the air was thick with possibility. By early April, the village's transformation was evident. Huts once steeped in cough smoke now smelled of dried herbs. Hearth fires were used more for brewing theriacs, multi-ingredient antidotes, than mere warmth. Even the local chapel displayed sprigs of green. Garlands of rosemary and bay hung from beams in hopeful defiance of winter's memory. The faithful passed beneath them, crossing themselves and murmuring thanks, their voices buoyed by the knowledge that their own hands had shaped the tools of survival. In the end, medieval peasant medicine was a testament to adaptation under relentless pressure. It fused fear and faith, science and sorcery, into practices that could both heal and harm. The remedies that saw villagers through their darkest months, pepper poultices, pine needle elixirs, cautery irons, were crude by modern standards, yet underpinned by an empirical ethos: observe, test, refine. From the ashes of winter's suffering rose a nascent understanding that the body could fight back, that community care mattered, and that knowledge, even in its most primitive form, was a bulwark against despair. So when you sip your chamomile tea or apply a salve to a scraped knee, remember the medieval peasants who first turned to the earth for healing. They may have lacked microscopes and test tubes, but they wielded mortar and pestle, prayer and practicality to stave off death's cold hand. Their legacy blooms every spring in our gardens and apothecaries, a living tribute to those who, in the bleakest winter, refused to surrender.
Hey guys, quick question. Ever tried fitting a dozen people into a coffin-sized room without Netflix? Welcome to medieval family living, where personal space was a myth and frostbite threatened your toes more than your in-laws. Imagine this. It's midwinter. The hearth's dying embers struggle against a wind that howls like a pack of famished wolves, and every ounce of warmth is sacred. In countless peasant cottages across Europe, entire clans, grandparents, parents, children, even the family goat on lucky nights, crowded into a single room to share body heat and stave off hypothermia. It sounds cozy until you realize you're jostling elbows with Uncle Bert, who snores like a war horn, and little Ethel, whose feet smell like damp hay. But why did medieval folks endure this human sardine can? Because conserving heat wasn't just frugality, it was survival. With only one hearth per home, fuel was precious. Wood, peat, and charcoal burned faster than gossip in the village square. Splitting firewood meant bargaining away tomorrow's warmth. Instead, families turned themselves into living radiators, huddling beneath straw mattresses and patched blankets, limbs intertwined in a desperate bid to keep Jack Frost at bay. This cramped communal sleeping had consequences. Privacy? Forget it. Courtship rituals happen under chaperone eyes. No romantic flutters without Grandma Marjorie listening. Night terrors spread like wildfire. If one child dreamed of wolves, all 12 jolted awake in a chorus of screams. And don't even think about kicking. With bodies piled high, a careless shift could send someone tumbling off the pallet into a frozen corner, guaranteed to earn you a scowl at dawn. Yet within this sardonic nightmare, a unique camaraderie emerged. Siblings learned to wedge themselves into impossible positions without complaining, Fathers guarded the hearth's dying coals with the vigilance of knights siege-bound. Mothers orchestrated nightly heat rotations, moving children like pieces on a board to distribute warmth evenly. Even the family dog earned honorary mattress space, its fur a vital hot spot in the center. Over the centuries, variations abounded. In Scandinavian cottages, wooden platforms called sang lined 3 walls, sleeping benches layered with straw, heaped with animal pelts. Families climbed in like climbing a tiered stage, grandfather at the top, newborn at the bottom, each tier offering slightly different temperatures. In alpine chalets, lofts above kitchens became sleeping quarters. Less room for goats, but more residual warmth from simmering stews below. In some regions, neighbors struck ingenious bargains. One cottage burned straw overnight in a small pit, then families cycled through to bask in its embers before bedtime. Others built communal dormitories, long halls with packed straw mats, where entire villages took turns, transforming privacy into a public good and forcing you to hope your bedmate wasn't the village drunk. Of course, the health implications were real. Overcrowding fueled lice, fleas, and the occasional rat. Respiratory illnesses spread on a single cough, turning that in-laws cold into a household epidemic. But fear of illness paled beside fear of freezing. For medieval peasants, the question wasn't, will we get sick? But, will we survive the night? And through it all, a certain dark humor prevailed. Tales circulated of the midnight mattress massacre, when an overzealous uncle rolled onto the family hearth tools, igniting a small blaze that sent everyone screaming into the snow, naked, terrified, but miraculously alive. Or the legend of the blanket bandit, a maiden so slight she vanished beneath layers of quilt, only to reappear at dawn atop 3 siblings' pillows. By dawn's gray light, families emerged from their single-room prisons, faces streaked with soot and straw, hair matted with sweat and dreams of warmth. They shuffled to chores, shoulders sore from nights of cramped vigilance, but hearts warmed by the knowledge that, come nightfall, they'd wage the same communal battle against the cold. That, my friends, is just the beginning. In Part 2, we'll dive into the ingenious architecture that turned houses into giant thermoses, the social rituals born from close quarters, and the absurdities of medieval bedtime etiquette. Stay toasty. If you wake up with someone's foot in your ribs, send them my regards. In the dim glow of dawn, as pale sunlight crept through tiny cracks in the wattle and daub walls, the village stirred. But at dusk, when night reclaimed the world, the same humble cottages transformed into human furnaces. Peasants understood one immutable law: fire wasted quickly, but bodies, well, bodies burned forever. To support this communal combustion, medieval builders employed surprisingly clever tricks. Walls were thick, sometimes up to 2 feet, composed of interwoven sticks plastered with mud, lime, and animal hair. This composite acted like primitive insulation, holding on to every last bit of warmth. Roofs were thatched so densely that wind seldom penetrated beneath, and eaves extended beyond walls, forming sheltered alcoves where straw bales were stored dry for bedding. Floor plans were simple: 1 main room for cooking, working, and most importantly, sleeping. No separate bedrooms. Privacy was a luxury for the wealthy, and every inch of floorboard served as a shared mattress platform. Enter the bed shelf, a wooden ledge built at waist height on 3 sides of the room. Come nightfall, families climbed onto these shelves, lowering a curtain of woven cloth to seal in body heat. Grandparents took the uppermost shelf, closest to the smoke vent, trading fresh air for warmth. Parents claimed the middle tiers, while children crowded the lowest shelf, nearest the cold draft but safest from sudden pushes. These tiers weren't padded with cotton. Instead, they were layered with rush mats, straw, and animal pelts, often sheepskin, prized for its insulating fleece. Atop this base lay rough wool blankets, patched and repatched through generations. These built-in bunk beds allowed for efficient use of vertical space, ensuring no soul slept on the frosty ground. But elevation came with its own perils. grandparents perched on the highest shelf risked perilous falls when sleep dragged them into the void. The occasional morning discovery of Granny tangled in rushes at the foot of the bed shelf was met not with outrage, but with sheepish apologies and a collective promise to leave one more straw mat next time. Hearth placement was equally strategic. It sat centrally along the longest wall, its opening facing the bed shelves. Flames licked embers at night, sending heat radiating outward and upward toward the sleeping tiers. A simple smoke vent in the roof allowed foul air to escape, but when night grew especially cold, families sometimes lowered a wooden plank over the vent, trapping the smoke purposefully to create a fumigating sauna effect, 1 part warmth, 1 part accidental respiratory therapy. The smell of birch smoke permeated every fiber of blanket and clothing, warding off insects and masking the stench of cramped bodies. Social rituals around bedtime emerged organically. As twilight deepened, the village bell tolled, not to summon a workforce, but to remind families it was time to retreat to the warm chamber. Children were herded inside, promptly stripped of outdoor clothes that hung near the hearth to dry rather than touch frozen walls. Parents joined the rush, cramming themselves onto the shelves, exchanging whispered greetings. There was no room for long goodnights. Each second wasted meant lost heat. Soft curses were hurled at latecomers, who stumbled through the door and kicked stray rushes in their haste. Once everyone was assembled, a hush settled. The only sounds were crackling embers and muffled snores. Candlelight, reserved for dire tasks, was extinguished. Moonlight through a narrow slit in the curtain provided the barest glow. In the oppressive darkness, bodies pressed together, a living quilt, each breath a tiny puff of warmth shared indiscriminately. The occasional squeal from a cold child or sneeze from a congested neighbor punctuated the silence, but most slept in the uneasy comfort of proximity. Intimacy blurred in this nightly furnace. Confidences were exchanged at bedtime, secret romances were whispered between boards, grievances aired softly in the dark, and children murmured bedtime, safety charms, learned from old mothers. Yet this closeness bred its own absurd etiquette. No kicking, no scratching, and absolutely no spitting, an offense punishable by ejection to the floor mattress for the next night. A peasant code grew. If thou makest a stink, thou dost walk the plank. Plank being a spare board on the ground, the coldest spot in the house. Romantic encounters required creativity. Courting couples maneuvered beneath the blankets, careful to avoid discovery by watchful siblings who snarled sleepily at any suspicious movement. Some cottages installed small wooden partitions on the bed shelves, temporary screens made of wicker and cloth, to grant lovers a modicum of privacy. But with every chink in the makeshift wall visible in the moonlight, discretion was a constant struggle. More than one elopement took place in the muffled darkness, a bride sneaking out with her beau and leaving behind a nest of ruffled blankets as the only evidence. The family goat, when permitted indoors, usually occupied a small wooden stall near the hearth, providing both milk and legs of additional warmth. Though the goat's hoarse bleats and the occasional chewing of straw added to the nighttime cacophony, its presence was invaluable. Goat hair blankets were prized, and mothers would tuck them around children's shoulders like protective cloaks. But unruly goats sometimes kicked hastily made ladders, toppling guests from the bed shelves in a comedic fire-starting ballet. One wrong hoof, and the straw bedding ignited, sending everyone scrambling into the snow. In wealthier villages, communal longhouses offered a broader take on the single-room concept. These barns-like structures housed multiple families on parallel bed shelves, with central haylofts overhead and a shared hearth in the middle. Each family claimed a section, marking it with simple carvings on the wooden beams. The communal heating meant a roaring fire that bathed dozens in warmth, but it also meant tensions over bed space, smoke distribution, and the occasional blame when a sleeping child wandered into unfamiliar territory. Disputes were settled at dawn, usually by drawing lots or rotating sleeping positions, a bureaucratic precursor to modern housing councils. Seasonal festivals celebrated this shared hardship. On midwinter nights, villagers invited visitors from neighboring hamlets to experience the renowned heat haggle, a ritual where travelers claimed prime heat spots for a night in exchange for stories or produce. In return, hosts welcomed them, knowing that an extra body boosted the collective furnace. Storytelling ensued. Tales of frost demons and heroic hunts, each narrator competing to elicit the biggest gasps in the close-quartered darkness. Once stories ended, the visitors unrolled their bedding, sliding in beside the host's clan, and everyone fell asleep to the shared rhythm of strangers' breathing. Yet, as ingenious as these adaptations were, the strain of communal living was relentless. Lice and fleas flourished in the humid, crowded air, infesting blankets and hair. Peasants combed through each other's locks by candlelight, tossing wriggling pests into the fire. The occasional citizen declared a cleanliness day, hauling bedding outside to beat the rush mats and straw, risking exposure to the chill but reclaiming a handful of comfort. Surface warmth might return by nightfall, but the underlying itch persisted until spring finally arrived. After weeks of this sardonic supplication to warmth, cracks in the communal formula began to show. Arguments flared over perceived hogging of prime spots. "Thou art ever creeping closer to the fire," became a common rebuke. Families experimented with personal foot stoves, small iron boxes filled with embers, tucked between blankets to provide local heat. But embers sparked accidents, sometimes igniting straw mattresses and forcing entire households to rebuild their bed shelves from scratch. By late winter, innovation peaked. Some peasants constructed simple wooden chests, filled with warmed stones during the day, then placed at the foot of each child's bed, acting as personal hot water bottles. Others wove pockets into blankets to hold small pouches of heated sand or hot water, passed from person to person before bedtime. These modest luxuries were closely guarded. Families traded hearth secrets like prized heirlooms, ensuring their own brood limited heat theft. Still, no novelty could replace the primal safety of bodies pressed close. Even as the village experimented, the fundamental truth remained: flesh on flesh was the cheapest fuel available. When winter's final storm blew in, and the hearth threatened to gutter, neighbors were invited inside, beds were expanded with fresh straw, and the line between families blurred. In that frozen crucible, humanity distilled to its essence: warmth, companionship, and the stubborn will to live. And so the medieval night ended, not with solitary slumber, but with a chorus of breath and heartbeat, a testament to communal resilience in the face of nature's indifferent cruelty. As dawn's first sunbeam cracked through the thick walls, survivors stirred, joints stiff but spirit unbroken, ready to face another day of toil, knowing full well that when darkness returned, they'd return to their shared nest, bodies entwined in the desperate ballet of winter's great endurance. When the moon hung low and the wind rattled the shutters like skeletal fingers, the village prepared for its nightly rite, the warmth muster. By the time the hearth fire cracked to embers, every soul, grandparent, babe, hound, and farmhand alike, had been funneled back into the single sleeping chamber. Here, in the half-light, the real work began. At the center of the room, the hearth's fading glow cast long shadows, and around it families formed concentric rings of flesh and bone. Mothers distributed heat tokens, wooled caps and mittens warmed by the dying coals, ensuring that the smallest, most vulnerable bodies got first dibs on precious insulation. Older children traded favors for an extra scarf, a day's worth of chores, a promise to share tomorrow's turnip mash, even a whispered secret about where the church hid its hidden store of candle stubs. Meanwhile, fathers performed a nightly ritual of coal attendance. One at a time, they kneeled beside the hearth, prodded the embers with a poker, and reinvigorated the fire with a thin splinter of wood. Each miniature flare of flame was a victory. A few more degrees, a few more minutes before the cold seeped into joints and dreams. Failure meant body heat drained into the walls, and soon the crowd would stir with the first complaints. "My knees ache, my fingers go numb, Grandpa's beard frosted over again." Children, for their part, treated the mattress like an obstacle course. Before settling, they raced each other to claim the hot zone, the exact spot on the pallet where the night's residual warmth ran deepest. Losers grudgingly chose the icy perimeter, feet dangling over the edge, toes twitching in protest. But a cunning child might sneak back during the general shuffle, swapping places with a snoozing sibling in a feat of ninja stealth that earned both giggles and a sharp elbow to the ribs. As bodies settled into an uneasy balance of warmth and crowding, the older generation broke the hush with a body whisper. A hissed instruction, arm this way, leg that, so that every limb nestled snugly against a neighbor, creating a living quilt of human heat. This Tetris-like puzzle required finesse, too much pressure, and someone wheezed, too little, and someone shivered. Each shift echoed with muffled curses. Mind thy elbow! Stop drooling on my cloak! I'm not thine footstool! In the darkest hours, the cold had a way of exploiting every crack. When a draft snuck beneath the door, a child's whimper cut through the gloom. Instantly, the blanket brigade sprang into action, hands plunged into folds of patched cloth, dragging extra layers above the chill-seeker's shoulder. Sometimes blankets tore under the strain, threads snapping like brittle bones. Blanket mending required immediate attention at dawn, scraps of old tunics stitched together by candlelight, forming ever-growing quilts of communal suffering. Sleep, when it came, was a truce rather than a surrender. Bodies twitched in dreams of summer's meadow or a baker's warm hearth. Some hallucinated entire feasts, roasted fowl, fresh milk, honeyed bread, before jerking awake to a single crust and a mug of near-freezing water. Others drifted into half-conscious vigil, aware of every sigh, every snore, every scrap of conversation muffled by blankets. A lull in the breathing chorus felt like a betrayal. Did someone slip away into the cold? Halfway through the night, there was the heat migration, an orchestrated roll call where clusters of sleepers shifted position. Parents took turns pivoting clusters like sails, making sure no one lingered too long at the icy edges. The rotation was precise. Infants moved toward the hearth, old limbs toward the room's perimeter, teenagers swapped places in a grudging barter. The heat migration was guided by wax-tipped candles fixed to poles, one flickering light illuminating the messy ballet of blankets and boots. Ancillary beasts of burden, goats, pigs, and the occasional chicken coop escapee, sometimes insinuated themselves onto the pallet. Their body heat was welcome, but their claws and beaks were not. A bleeding goat might kick off blankets at the worst moment, while chickens roosting underneath left droppings that required a thorough bedding swap at dawn. Still, peasants learned that a barnyard interloper was preferable to the alternative, waking in a puddle of one's own frozen breath. By the cusp of dawn, when the sky fainted into pale gray, families held their breath, fearing any movement could spark a collapse. A single cough could trigger a snaking wave of jostling limbs. If one person fell, a domino effect toppled the lot, screams piercing the dusk as peasants tumbled into each other and out onto the floor. These catastrophes were met with exasperated sighs rather than panic. Again with the snoring, Bertha? Or, next time, mind thy balance. When the first rooster crowed, or, more commonly, an impatient father banged a wooden spoon against the hearth, families emerged from the human furnace like survivors crawling from a wreck. They disentangled themselves from the blankets, brushed straw from hair, and tiptoed past dozing neighbors to stoke the fire for tea and gruel. Early risers often traded news, whether the midwife's new twins had survived, whether the blacksmith's apprentice had perished of cough, whether the barley sowed in hope of spring would freeze in the ground. Through the long winter, these nightly marathons of close quarters forged unexpected bonds. Cousins who'd long quarreled over land the size of a rabbit's warren found themselves forced into alliance when the cold pressed in. Women traded secret recipes for chewy barley cakes that doubled as pillow stuffing. Men swapped tips on how to stuff straw beneath doorframes without drawing village scorn. In the darkness, distinctions blurred, kin by blood, neighbors by location, and strangers by need became one snarling vessel against the cold. Yet beneath the grim comedy lay a sobering truth. Every body in that chamber was a lifeline. Even the scrawniest child, with ribs protruding like picket fences, contributed precious heat. No one could be excluded. Frost's privilege was a luxury no one could afford. On the rare nights when a traveler arrived, frozen, footsore, and half-blind with exhaustion, families reluctantly made room on the shelves. The guest's presence meant less warmth per person, but also fewer chapped lips in the silence between breaths. Local lore immortalized the most extreme nights. There was the icicle night, when a sudden freeze dropped the temperature so low that candle wicks refused to burn. Families clung together in absolute darkness, adding body warmth to the hearth's ghost glow until dawn. Or the storm of blizzards, when snowdrifts piled waist-high against the door, and the only break in the primal huddle was to shovel a narrow tunnel for fresh air. Tales of those nights became tavern staples come spring, told with wide eyes and theatrical shivers. Of course, communal sleeping exacted its toll on health. Lung ailments rippled through families like plague. Bedbug bites turned into festering sores. Cramped positions caused jostled kidneys and cracked ribs. Yet even the sick were too valuable to leave outside. A measly ember of hearth life was preferable to solitary death in the snowdrift. So the mocking cough was tolerated, the fevered shiver endured, all for the sake of shared survival. And when at last the sun grew bolder, melting the thick frost that sealed cottage doors, people ventured out with cautious joy. They shed layers of wool and straw, shook blankets in the courtyard until dust clouds billowed, and cracked windows wide to breathe pure, cold air. Yet when night fell again, even in March, families returned to the old ways, gathering on the shelves with renewed gratitude for each other's warmth. By the end of winter, peasants emerged not only hardened against the cold, but also profoundly changed. Those who'd once prided themselves on independence had learned the art of collective endurance. They recognized that in the medieval world, survival hinged not on solitary courage, but on the ragged, jostling mass of human heat. Their homes, once humble shelters, had become crucibles of kinship, where flesh and spirit fused in the desperate ballet of winter's worst nights. And so, with spring's promise on the horizon, they prepared to dismantle the bed shelves and air out the blankets, storing away the lessons of communal living until next season's first frost. The villagers walked away with bodies sore, noses red, and hearts oddly warmed by the memory of shared suffering, a testament to the fact that even in a world this brutal, people found a way to huddle together, to cradle each other against the cold, and to laugh, however wryly, at their own absurd predicament. As winter's final grip loosened and the snowbanks slumped into muddy drifts, families faced their last communal nights before spring offered its meager reprieve. Even as earliest green shoots teased from thawed earth, the bitter truth remained, until the thaw grew firm, the nightly contest with cold still demanded human furnaces. In those waning weeks, ingenuity peaked. Mothers devised pillow to pillow, relay warmth. A child pressed a pillow they'd warmed against a bowl of steaming broth, then passed it along the bedding line so siblings could sip warmth into their bellies before tucking the pillow back under frozen cheeks. Fathers hollowed out wooden shoe forms, filling them with heated river stones wrapped in cloth. Assembled 2 by 2, these primitive foot warmers became coveted underblanket treasures. Even the goats got an upgrade. Families wove straw mats with tail holes so the animals could stay tucked in on the lowest shelf without trampling toddlers in the dark. Yet for all these comforts, the strain of close quarters pressed relentlessly. Every exhaled breath fogged the thin glass of the single window. Morning revealed frost crystals clinging to cloak hems and frozen snot on pillow edges. Roosters crowed to a chorus of groans as bleary-eyed survivors disentangled themselves, stiff as board planks, and stumbled into the cold kitchen to stoke the hearth for the day's first meal, usually a thin gruel of boiled grains sweetened with what little honey remained. By the last nights before spring, the midnight murmurs ceremony emerged as a custom of catharsis. At the stroke of midnight, families paused their sleeping shuffle, and each person whispered a hardship endured, a lost sibling to winter cough, a night spent shivering at the edge, a fear of the next frost. As voices choked on tears and steam, others pressed closer, offering soft words or a hand to grasp. Then, in a ritual echoing baptism, the group would hum an old lullaby low enough to drift into dreams, an act of solidarity that transformed the cot into a sanctuary rather than a prison. This fragile peace gave way to one final peril: the freeze-over sweep. When temperatures plunged unexpectedly in those unpredictable March nights, frost seized rainy footprints and refrosted broken windows closed only hours before. In response, a nightly patrol was organized. The sweepers carried torches and burlap sacks of straw, sealing gaps around doors and replastering cracked walls with mud mixed by hand. Children too small to help fetched water warmed by hot stones, while apprentices cranked the hearth vent open to draw fresh air, even at the cost of a chilled draft. The sweep took hours, but village lore credits it with saving dozens of lives from the cruel snap of a late freeze. And then, at last, the dawn when thaw held. A ribbon of slush replaced the hard crust at the doorstep. Icicles dripped in the weak sun. Families emerged, blinking against brightness, and gathered blankets and bedding for the annual airing. This was no casual chore but a festival of liberation. Blankets were draped over fences in the churchyard. Straw mats flailed against wooden beams until dust clouds billowed like ghosts of winters past. The whole village paused in reverent silence, watching the sunlight fall across relics of their nocturnal endurance. That evening, the bed shelves lay empty until dark, as if ashamed of their years-long duty. Sparks flickered in the hearth for cooking, not heating, and bodies returned to more modest piles. A parent's pallet on rush mats, a child's trundle bed, even a neighbor's spare straw mattress set outside for the first time, an experimental step toward private sleeping. The transition was uneasy. Solitude felt alien after months of ceaseless proximity. Some toddlers whimpered for missing shoulders. Grandparents clicked tongues at wasted shelf space. Yet the unspoken relief was palpable. A whisper of air against one's cheek now signified freedom rather than frost. Over the following weeks, the impact of shared survival took root in daily life. Widow Marjorie stitched a communal quilt from fragments of the patched blankets, selling squares to each family as a memento, part warmth, part social contract. The quilt hung in the manor hall as a reminder that even lords relied on peasant bodies to endure nature's whims. Children painted small clay charms, horseshoes entwined with heart symbols, and tied them to bedposts, believing these talismans would protect them from future winter's perils. Apprentices began to write warmth compendia, simple notebooks of best practices, where to plaster a wall crack, how to knot blankets for even distribution, which animal pelts repelled cold most effectively, and how to rotate sleepers without waking them. These manuscripts circulated from cottage to cottage, forming the backbone of what would become regional folk wisdom. Though few peasants could read, travelers carried these scraps of knowledge across county lines, sowing the seeds of shared cultural resilience. The architecture itself evolved. Builders experimented with heat lobbies, small vestibules added at doorways so families could remove outer garments without letting icy air flood the main room. Some wealthier peasants retrofitted their cottages with double doors and mud-packed window shutters. In alpine valleys, artisans crafted lattice partitions from pine boughs, sectioning off sleeping niches within the larger chamber to balance collective warmth with personal space. Each innovation traced its origin to those brutal nights when bodies lay entombed in each other's breaths. And of course, legend grew. Tales of the Great Night of Hearts, when every family in the valley huddled into the new communal longhouse for a final winter's vigil, were retold at every tavern hearth come spring. Minstrels sang of the blanket witch, a mysterious figure said to appear on the coldest night, cloaked in furs and distributing secret bundles of warm straw to the doomed. Children listened with wide eyes, faces still flushed from midday sun, and believed that as long as they remembered the old ways, no winter could ever kill them. By early summer, the sleeping arrangements resembled something halfway between Arctic encampments and modern beds. Woven linen mattresses stuffed with wool, small foot stoves warmed by coals, now deemed safer, and straw-lined wall niches for individual households. Yet the memory of the single-room furnace persisted. At each harvest festival, elders recounted with wry pride how they'd fit 20 souls into a space no larger than a common loft, and how the goats bleating had once ignited half the bed shelf in a misplaced ember. These stories served less to terrify than to bind the community. We survived this. Together. In the end, the practice of sleeping en masse did not vanish overnight. More remote hamlets continued the tradition for years, adapting it to local materials. Mud brick shelters in eastern valleys, stone hovels in upland moors, all built around the principle that flesh on flesh was the cheapest fuel. It took centuries for stoves, chimneys, and glazed windows to render human furnaces unnecessary. By then, the cultural memory of close-quartered winters had infused poetry, superstitions, and even matrimonial customs. Newlyweds were still expected to share a test night in the old bed shelf as a rite of endurance. Today, we light thermostats instead of hearth fires, retreat behind insulated walls instead of woven rush matting, and collapse into king-size beds rather than clamber up bed shelves. Yet the spirit of those medieval nights endures whenever families pile into a single room during a power outage, when strangers cram into shelters after storms, or when we huddle in sleeping bags on a camping trip. We carry in our bones the lesson that heat is more than physics. It's an act of community, a shared heartbeat against the dark. So the next time you complain about your drafty apartment, or reach for the thermostat, spare a thought for those peasant ancestors who spent half their lives wedged together in shivering darkness, confessing fears at midnight, and inventing the technologies of home with mud, straw, and human will. Their cramped shoulders, tangled blankets, and collaborative survival were the crucible in which resilience was forged, and their nightly endurance remains the warmest legacy we've inherited. Hey guys, ever found yourself buried in snow with nothing but a soggy cloak and a prayer to keep you alive? No? Well, buckle up, because if you thought your last camping trip was rough, imagine being a medieval peasant in the middle of a blizzard with zero DIY channel tutorials. When winter's wrath hit without warning, blizzards whipping farms clean of color, wind-driven drifts swallowing fences whole, peasants resorted to last-ditch engineering feats that made modern cube homes look like luxury real estate. With nothing but their wits, a few scraps of wood, and every ounce of mud their frozen fingers could scrape off the ground, they built emergency shelters to survive nights when even the wolves stayed inside. First came the frantic scouting. As snow piled ankle-deep or higher, waiting too long meant hypothermia, frostbite, or becoming tomorrow's gruel ingredient. So villagers split into ragtag teams, father and son, neighbor and wife, armed with spades or sharpened sticks, hunting for any exposed earth. Under the howl of wind, they dug shallow trenches along hedgerows or the lee side of barns, scooping snow into piles that would become insulation walls. Every flake thrown back was a small victory, one more barrier between skin and storm. Next came the walls, using mud mixed with straw, because nothing says home improvement like half-rotted hay. Artisans, fancy title for muddy peasants, plastered the trench's inner face. The mud froze instantly to form a crude barrier, while straw fibers trapped air pockets for insulation. If they could find turf or sod, they'd stack those atop the trench's rim, creating a roofless bunker that kept wind gusts at bay. It wasn't cozy, but it beat lying flat in an open field hoping angels had spare cloaks. Then the roof, or lack thereof, fully covering the trench risked collapse under heavy snow, so most villages opted for a half roof, a simple frame of bent saplings lashed together with leather thongs or twisted roots. Over this skeleton, they draped animal skins, rush mats, or spare thatch, leaving a small opening for smoke and breathing. This made Hifleen to look like a medieval flat-screen TV with one corner missing, but if you crawled inside, you discovered a miracle: wind-stilled space warmed by body heat and a tiny hearth at the edge. Speaking of hearths, fire was the fragile heart of any shelter. Peasants scavenged resinous pine branches or fat wood chunks, nature's own tinder, to coax that first spark. They dug a shallow pit inside the trench, lined it with flat stones if they had them, and lit a tiny fire so it wouldn't suffocate the cramped space. Smoke curled out the roof opening, drawing fresh air in through gaps, while the pit's heat radiated under skins and blankets, turning the snow fort into a prismatic furnace. But why stop at trenches? When snow was deep and mud scarce, peasants turned to snow caves, improvised igloos without Eskimo design manuals. With bent sticks or sharpened spades, they carved a dome-shaped cavity into a drift's side, spiraling inward like a frozen snail shell. The hard-packed snow acted as perfect insulation. Outside temperatures might plunge to bone-numbing lows, but inside a snow cave, you'd sweat in your wool tunic. Crafting these caves was backbreaking work, long hours hunched over in the cold, but the payoff was survival. Of course, safety was a gamble. Too little snow meant collapse. Too much weight above could bury you alive. So crews tested ceilings by prodding with poles, listening for hollow echoes. If the snow rang, the shelter held potential. If it thudded, they scraped more until it was thick enough to bear foot traffic. Once inside, they erected low benches of wooden planks or stacked turf to keep bodies off the cold floor. A final layer of rush mats or straw transformed the bench into a semblance of a medieval futon. For those with better resources, or more ambitious carpentry skills, there were mud and straw huts. Villagers framed a simple A-frame of poles driven into frozen ground, then wove branches or stakes between them. Over this skeleton, they slapped thick daubs of mud mixed with manure and straw, yielding walls that rivaled Swiss chalets in insulation, minus the windows and balconies. A central smoke hole doubled as chimney. Door coverings ranged from oiled cloth to wooden shutters scavenged from abandoned barns. These temporary hovels took longer to build, up to a full day's labor, but could last the entire winter if maintained. Inside these shelters, the peasant family squeezed together, knees pressed against chins, breathing in shared warmth. Provisions were minimal: jerky strips, salted fish, or parched grains saved for emergencies. Cooking happened on a small spit over embers, the smell of roasting meat mingling with damp earth and animal hair. Conversation was terse: plans for spring sowing, rumors of lost livestock, or which neighbor's cow had finally given in to the cold. Any laughter risked chilly gusts, or worse, hungry wolves tracking the scent. And then there were the stories. Legendary nights when snow reached windowsills and frost turned mud walls into ice. Tales of shelter collapses that buried peasants until morning search parties pulled them out limping but alive. Stories passed around the hearth of the Mud Witch, a spectral figure said to appear in the black of night, her gown a dripping amalgam of earth and blood, offering guidance on where to dig the deepest trench, and where to avoid thin ice pitfalls. These rumors kept scavengers away from dangerous areas but sparked midnight expeditions by the desperate hoping for a map to salvation. By dawn, if the shelter held and the hearth embers glowed, survivors emerged blinking into a world turned white. Mud walls gleamed with frost. Makeshift roofs sagged under new drifts. But for a few beaten-down souls, it was proof they could cheat death another night. They collapsed into snowbanks like wounded soldiers, breathing cold air, and then rose to dig out paths back to the village, every step a testament to medieval ingenuity under the harshest conditions. That's just part 1. In part 2, we'll dive into the secret tools peasants kept hidden for emergencies, how they turned livestock shelters into snowproof compounds, and the absurd superstitions that sometimes doomed more people than the cold itself. Keep your cloak close and your spade closer, because the storm isn't over yet. As the sun sank and temperatures began their nightly plunge, peasants retreated from open fields and mortar huts to a hidden arsenal of emergency tools, implements passed down through generations and kept tucked beneath floorboards or behind false panels in the barn. The first among these was the saw, a crude blade carved from recycled plowshares and fitted into a wooden handle. In a blizzard, its owner could hack through glazed drifts 15 feet deep, opening corridors to deeper snow caves or widening entrances in living trenches. The rasping of metal on ice was no lullaby, but it meant you weren't trapped. Next came the fire fork, a forked sapling hardened over embers and sharpened at both tines. Hung beside the hearth, it doubled as a poker, spade, an emergency tripwire defender, lean it across your doorway, and any intruder, be it wolf or desperate vagrant, tripped straight into a stash of hurled snowballs or a tangled net of ropes. In some villages, a specially carved notch held a chunk of fatwood, burning bright if the fork was dislodged and setting off a rudimentary alarm system. Crack, crack, snap, and the household sprang into action. Perhaps the most prized possession was the mud trowel, a small hand-forged iron spatula designed not for masonry but for smearing fresh mud onto cracks in walls and trenches. Carried in a leather pouch at the belt, it allowed peasants to perform midnight repairs when frost shattered existing daubs. A quick smear, a few handfuls of straw, and the shelter held wind and snow at bay for another long night. These tools weren't sold at markets. They were given as gifts at weddings, baptismal ceremonies, even whispered into wills, proof that in a world ruled by winter, specialized survival gear was as sacred as holy relics. When family flocks and herds needed protection, peasants converted livestock pens into fortified compounds. Empty pigsties became command centers, stout oak walls repurposed as defensive bulwarks, with narrow slits cut at adult chest height to peer and hurl torches at attacking wolves. Sheepfolds, ordinarily flimsy wooden fences, were reinforced with turf blocks dug from summer's abandoned fields. Layering turf outside the pen's exterior created a double-thick wall that repelled snowdrifts and muffled winter's howling winds. In these compound yards, animals huddled behind their human guardians, contributing body heat and often preventing the collapse of the primitive roofs. Inside the fortified barn, hayloft ladders were yanked out and ladders placed across the rafters to form elevated sleeping platforms. Up there, above the animals and their ammonia-tinged warmth, the air was fresher, though only marginally. 11 people might squeeze onto a single platform, knees touching chins, but it was preferable to freezing at floor level. Beneath them, the herd stirred, hooves kicking stray straw and the occasional low bleat reminding everyone why livestock had been invited in the first place. Superstitions wove through these conversions like twisted roots. Sprinkling a pinch of salt across the threshold was said to keep cold spirits from entering. Placing iron horseshoes, hoofs side down, above central beams prevented ice wraiths from stealing warmth. And to ensure the snow cave or trench didn't collapse, villagers tied a length of red wool to the tallest sapling poles supporting the roof. If the pole bent or broke, the wool snapped, sounding a warning to flee before being buried. These rituals weren't mere theatrics. They were the difference between a living refuge and a frozen tomb. By lantern light, elders told cautionary tales of improvised shelters gone wrong. The snow cave in Eastmore that collapsed because a traveler scoffed at the red wool signal and kept carving inward until the ceiling caved. Or the farmhouse trench sealed by overzealous mud plastering, which trapped smoke inside and suffocated the occupants before dawn. Such stories reinforced the unwritten contract: follow the lore, respect the elements, and you might wake come morning. Break the rules, and winter would accept no excuses. In some regions, peasants perfected a hybrid design, the smoke trench. Instead of raising a parapet of earth and turf, they dug a shallow channel around the hut's perimeter and built a narrow, stone-lined flue that led smoke away from the hearth and down into the trench. When lit, smoke pooled in the moat, creating a dense fog barrier that deterred wolves and masked human scent. Inside, families buried themselves under blankets while smoke seeped through small cracks, creating a surreal, sauna-like cocoon. The asthmatic coughed, the sneezing spread contagion, but for the healthy, it was a small price to pay for wolf-proof comfort. And if mud and snow weren't enough, peasants sometimes resorted to organic insulation, layers of leaves, reeds, and even dead bracken for walls. In villages near marshes, dried reed bundles were lashed between sapling frames, arranged with reed tips pointing outward to deflect wind. When coated in mud, this reed thatch kept interiors surprisingly warm. Meanwhile, on woodland fringes, families harvested bracken ferns in autumn, fanning them into mats stored in attic lofts. Laid against trench walls or over snow cave roofs, the bracken's natural oils repelled moisture and trapped air. It smelled pungent, but when you're alive, scent becomes an afterthought. By the night's darkest hour, these shelters became microcosms of medieval life, distant howls punctuated by the rasp of saws and the slap of mud on walls, the glow of firelight dancing off damp hides, the muted murmur of prayers and curses traded in equal measure. Children stared into flickering embers, wide-eyed as parents recited the steps of shelter building as if reading a liturgy. Every beam and daub bore witness to ancestors who died in frozen fields, and every survival meant another story to pass on. At dawn, the man-made bastions revealed their imperfections: frost-spattered walls, cracks oozing melted snow, the hearth's embers reduced to gray ash. But after one more improvised breakfast of cold porridge and half-roasted turnips, the shelter's occupants emerged, stiff-jointed, squinting, but triumphant. They shoveled tunnels back to the village, retrieved tools, and returned before midday's thaw could undermine their fragile defenses. And so the medieval peasant's secret to winter survival lay not in steel walls or glass windows, but in mud, snow, and generations of hard-won superstition. The next time you curse a sleet storm, remember the ice saw hidden under a floorboard, the red wool fluttering in a snow cave's breeze, and the thousands of nights spent half-buried in mud-plastered trenches, proof that, in a world that despised comfort, ingenuity kept life flickering on. By the time the midday sun dipped low and temperatures began their plunge, medieval peasants hunkered down in their improvised sanctuaries for the night's second, and fiercest, assault. Part 3 charts those long hours of darkness, the rituals and adjustments that followed initial shelter construction, and the near-obsessive tinkering necessary to stay alive when every breath could freeze in your lungs. 1. Fine-tuning the snow cave interior. Once the basic cave was carved and a small hearth stoked, survivors turned to interior enhancements. Kitchen benches, a few split planks or a broad flat rock, were placed flush against the cave's inner wall, raising bodies off the sodden floor and preventing the chilling damp from traveling upward. When straw was plentiful, thin mattresses of bundled rushes were laid atop these benches. Moth-eaten though they were, rush mats were effective insulators. A final touch, beaten deer hides, still pliable from summer tanning, were spread beneath sleeping clusters. The hides sealed gaps in the rush mats, blocking drafts that sneaked in at ground level. At the cave's rear, niches were hollowed out into the packed snow walls, mini alcoves just wide enough for a wooden box of provisions. These supply crannies held salted meat, dried fish, or a few turnips. Keeping food off the floor prevented it from freezing solid or becoming buried under drifting snow. Clever peasants covered each niche with a flap of oiled cloth, sometimes rendered from pounded animal fat, to keep moisture out and allow for quick access when night's hunger pangs struck. 2. Smoke management and ventilation. A constant challenge in these enclosed spaces was balancing smoke clearance with heat retention. Too much smoke and you choked. Too little ventilation and you risked suffocation. The solution lay in a primitive, smoke snorkel, a length of hollowed sapling or reed stalk lashed together to form a vertical conduit. One end stuck into the hearth's throat, the other poked through the cave roof or a smoke hole. The pipe's rigidity prevented collapse, and its narrow diameter allowed rising fumes to escape, while minimizing the open gap through which cold might invade. When materials were scarce, villagers improvised. Wisps of fern stems bound together formed makeshift flues. Even folded strips of cloth coated in fat, acting as low-tech smoke wicks, could draw fumes upward by capillary action. Smoke danced through these channels in lazy spirals, leaving the cave's center remarkably clear. Successful ventilation became a point of pride. Families boasted of breathable caves, as deftly as hunters brag of winter hauls. 3. The thermal curtain trick. Beyond basic partitions, peasants refined heat zones with thermal curtains. Using spare wool cloth or patchwork blankets, they hung layers from the cave ceiling at waist height, effectively splitting the interior into a lower, cooler work area and an upper, warmer sleeping loft. By corralling warm air above the curtain, they reduced the volume that needed heating. Those on kitchen duty, tending the embers and cooking the next day's porridge, remained below, their chill breath drawn downward and away from the sleepers overhead. At evening's onset, the curtain was raised to enclose the loft. Come dawn, it was lowered to ventilate and prevent the sweat-soaked cloth from mildew. Curtain maintenance became a nightly chore, shakes to dislodge ash, rewashes in buckets of hot, soapy water, often urine, prized for its ammonia content, and midnight tugs to reseal gaps that threatened to leak precious warmth. 4. Firewood rationing and warm-up shifts. No shelter, however well insulated, could survive without a regulated fuel supply. Firewood, peat, and charcoal were counted like coin. To conserve resources, families instituted warm-up shifts, brief intervals, sometimes as short as 5 minutes, where the hearth was banked low, embers tamped down under ash to smolder, and only a small poker fire kept alive. Every 2 hours, someone raked the embers back into flame for 10 minutes to restore heat before banking down again. This ebb and flow created a heartbeat of warmth, rhythmic pulses that, if timed correctly, kept body temperatures just above hypothermia thresholds. Assigning shifts was a duty everyone, children included, helped share. A young lad, shivering in his wool tunic, might cheerfully take the midnight relay, hacking at coals with his tiny fire fork and earning adult respect for keeping the heart alive. 5. Behavioral adjustments, movement protocols. Movement inside these cramped spaces risked destabilizing fragile ceilings or stirring up dust that etched frost in one's lungs. Thus peasants developed strict, step protocols, crawling low, sliding feet forward rather than lifting them, and always keeping one hand on the bench for balance. When someone absolutely needed to stand, to stretch stiff joints or sneeze violently, they announced, "By grace I rise," a verbal cue that warned others to brace the ceiling poles. This etiquette extended to coughing fits. A sudden hack could break the cave roof or divert embers into fleeing smoke. So villagers learned cough tucks, covering mouth and nose, holding one breath, and leaning toward the hearth side to create a lee where ash wouldn't cascade downward. Those who failed this delicate dance were playfully scolded, but they knew a collapsed cave meant a dozen lives at risk. 6. Emergency repair techniques. Snow and mud shelters, battered by storms and shifting ground, often required urgent fixes in the dead of night. Peasants carried repair kits, hidden in hollowed logs or under straw piles, small leather pouches containing mud trowels, straw bundles, scrap cloth, and fish glue, a gelatinous mix boiled from fish bones. When a crack formed or a roof panel sagged, a quick application of fish glue, coated onto mud, sealed gaps until daylight. With the addition of a handful of heated stones, pressed against the patched area, the improvised seal dried rapidly, binding wall components before cold could reclaim the breach. This patchwork approach wasn't perfect. Repaired sections often sweat water that later froze into jagged icicles, but it bought peasant families the precious hours needed to either complete a full rebuild or wait out a passing gale. 7. Psychological strategies, lighting and storytelling. Surviving the storm wasn't only about physical engineering, it demanded mental fortitude. Harsh darkness amplified fear, so peasants used low-burning fat lamps, small bowls of rendered animal fat with a rush wick, to cast a gentle, steady glow. These lamps were set into shallow sockets carved into snow walls or placed on wooden ledges. Their dim light warded off panic and allowed family storytellers to spin yarns that reinforced communal bonds. These stories followed a consistent pattern. Heroes overcame sinister winter spirits, clever peasants outwitted avalanche demons, and wise elders revealed secret arrows for warding frost giants. Each tale was rich with building tips: where to angle sapling supports, how to layer turf most effectively, and recited like sacred manuals. Children memorized them, ensuring that if elders failed to survive, knowledge wouldn't perish in the drift. 8. Shared vigilance and roles. In any well-ordered shelter, there emerged a hierarchical division of labor: fire marshal, mudguard, crack watcher, ventilation officer, and night scribe. The fire marshal monitored ember pressure and signaled when to shift warm-up rotations. The mudguard patrolled wall integrity, tapping every half hour to detect softening or hollowed spots. The ventilation officer kept the smoke snorkel clear, sliding polymer mushrooms or moss plugs in or out to calibrate airflow. The night scribe, a title more honorific than official, jotted charcoal marks on wood scraps, recording the shelter's hourly performance and alerting morning crews which repairs to prioritize. These roles rotated with each storm, ensuring no single family member bore the full burden. Rotations prevented fatigue-induced mistakes. An ember left unchecked could spark roof collapse. A cracked wall could flood the bench with drifting snow. When dawn finally broke, scribal records guided daylight rebuilds, and the entire team used collective memory to perfect next night's defense. 9. Integration of livestock for auxiliary heat. In some frontier villages, goats, pigs, and even chickens were brought into the shelter to serve as biological heaters. Pens were constructed at the trench edge or inside mud huts, short fences of brushwood bound with leather thongs, creating stalls that kept animals confined but close. The faint alarm of startled livestock, snorts, bleats, rumbles, served as a living thermostat. Cooler air hushed the barnyard, warmer air sent intermittent grunts and shuffles. Peasants learned to interpret these cues. A pig's deepest snort meant the shelter had cooled beyond comfort. A sudden chicken cluck meant a gust had leaked in somewhere. Shepherds, driven half-mad by darkness, became proficient at night calls, soft whistles that gathered stray fowl back to the pen before they wandered off into perilous drifts. 10. Final pre-dawn breathing ritual. Just before the first light, when frost clung thickest and hope seemed most distant, families engaged in a communal breathing ritual called the warmth breath. Heads bowed, they inhaled deeply through fabric filters, layers of cloth soaked in vinegar or pine oil, and then exhaled halfway, holding that warmth inside. Each inhale cleansed the lungs. Each exhale circulated heat within the group. This synchronized breathing not only induced calm but also distributed warmth via shared moist air, an unspoken recognition that collective warmth trumped individual survival. As heads rose, sleep-fogged eyes met in a silent vow. Tomorrow, they would do it all again, and the cave would stand another night. By bending wood, mixing mud, whispering cautionary tales, and organizing human and animal labor into a nightly scheme of mutual support, medieval peasants turned snow and mud into life-saving fortresses. Part 4 will recount spring's gradual failure of these shelters, the perilous transition back to open fields, and how survivors ultimately abandoned their icy citadels in favor of new homes built on lessons forged beneath winter's uncompromising weight. As frost thaws into slush and snowbanks shrink into filth-drenched mounds, medieval peasants faced their final challenge: transforming snow and mud shelters back into living spaces, or abandoning them for long-term refuge. In Part 4, we witnessed the transition from survival mode to renewal, and how communities turned battered forts into foundations for spring and beyond. By the time the thaw softly cracked the surface of packed snow, even the toughest snow cave bore telltale signs of surrender: dripping walls, sagging ceilings, muddy floors. Families emerged with cautious hope, blinking in gray daylight. Morning shifted into a flurry of clean-up besieges, hauling out melted snow, sopping floors with handfuls of straw, reconstructing interior benches, and patching smoke vents with mud and plank scraps to hold warmth through the final nights. It was communal labor, akin to a fireside ritual, each splatter of mud a testament to endurance. These shelters, no longer fortress-like, became transition zones. Livestock resettled outdoors as they nosed toward green shoots. Household smoke funnels were left open to ventilate moldy straw, and storytellers paused their winter sagas to recount rescue tales, how they survived avalanches of collapsing snow cave walls, or patching mud trenches at 3 a.m. by lantern glow. With daylight climbing higher, soil softened and traditional cottages beckoned. But escape wasn't instant. A local tradition, called the Return of the Hearth, marked the first night villagers slept in their original homes again. They removed all patchwork mud daub from walls, aired rush beds thoroughly, and stoked hearths early with wood previously hoarded for shelter fortification. It was symbolic. Leaving snow caves signaled victory over winter, and rekindled pride in their earthy, permanent homes. Yet pests had followed them. Snow caves bred fleas, mites, even weevils. Next came the blessing of the blankets ceremony. Elders soaked bedding in vinegar water, hung them over clotheslines above flickering bonfires, and stamped them with prayers. Clean blankets were layered with new rush mats. Bedding remained aired for 3 nights before reuse, the medieval answer to modern laundering. This spring cleaning extended to the livestock pens once pressed into service. Reed insulation used for snow trenches was scraped off and reused in summer duck ponds and compost beds. Turf bricks from compound walls were returned to fallow fields, torn apart by hoe and spade to enrich the soil. Burned embers from hearth pits were sifted out and scattered in garden paths to enhance nutrients. And then there was rebuilding. Wattle and daub walls that had been patched for emergency survival were improved. Eroded clay was replaced with fresh mud mix, walls reinforced with straw fibers from summer harvests. Evidence of past shelters remained, thicker walls on one side, mismatched planks near doors, small drainage grooves carved into thresholds. Marks of adaptation that became accepted features of the homestead. The village elder, who had been snow caves, scribe of shelter, led a spring symposium beneath a blooming hawthorn. Families gathered to compare scribbles and notebook scraps. Which cave orientation held heat best, how thick mud walls needed to be, where to plant quick-growing summer grass to restock thatch for winter. These symposiums, half technical briefing, half festive gossip, marked the birth of itinerant shelter guilds. Members swapped tools, loaned iron mud trowels, traded ember-safe fire forks, and shared reed mats and wool blankets. Plans were sketched on bark scrolls, designs evolving. By summer's peak, fir saplings grew from buried branches used in trench framing. Some villages planted small hedgerows along fields, not just for livestock shelter, but to serve future trench windbreaks, living infrastructure seeded from winter survival. Over decades, this heritage shaped architecture. Raised earthen porches appeared common across peasant cottages. Mud plaster layered house foundations for nightly coolness buffering. Smoke snorkels evolved, small clay vents built into roofs, preempting snow cave flue designs. Craftsmen still made sabi, mud trowels, finely balanced for plaster work, tools fitting snugly in leather belts, cadence echoing in weddings and funerals alike. For younger villagers, the snow shelter trials became rite of passage rites. Boys and girls paired up, sharpened ice saws and built mini trenches each winter. Pride was taken in vault-like snow caves strong enough to hold weight of 2 full sheep. Winners gained community respect and ownership of the Shelter Guild's codex, responsible for teaching novices and maintaining the flue-wick snare. By mid-century, few remembered the first time trenches had been plowed through frost, but stones etched on hearth bricks reminded them, tiny glyphs recording freeze dates, snow cave ceilings, and hearth rotations turned into calendars of resilience. These markings guided planting dates, predicting when winter shelters must be rebuilt. All this ingenuity and tradition were born from necessity, shelter against snow and mud when death lay a misstep away. Modern viewers might admire they had no maps or manuals, but every trench, snow cave, and mud hut was a chapter in an ongoing survival manual, each storm season iteration making the next easier, each family variation tested and sometimes shared. So as medieval peasants laid aside shovels and spades for plowshares and pruning hooks, they didn't just return to farming, they carried forward a legacy of community engineering, seasonal ritual, and adaptive practicality. Their homes, fields, and even barn walls were living texts of that survival wisdom, written in mud, straw, and human will. Let this stand as testament. Emergency shelter from snow and mud wasn't just straw and dirt. It was collective intelligence born in crisis, evolving into everyday resilience. When you house yourself against winter's worst today, remember, you walk paths laid by mud-handed ancestors who, in darkest nights, shaped cold into shelter and life.